Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, a few years ago, some of you are already aware of this, without exactly deciding to do so, I found that I was watching only movies and TV series, internet series, about 16th century Tudor royalty. And this went on for quite some time. Kings and queens and their courts. I started with Henry VIII and watched everything I could find about him. That is not an exaggeration. I watched every series, every movie that was available to me. Then I moved on to his daughters, Elizabeth I and Mary I, and their cousin and rival, Mary, Queen of Scots. And just when I was about to move on to other subject matter, PBS gave us Victoria, and Netflix gave us The Crown, and I was hooked again, only this time on more contemporary monarchs, such as Elizabeth II and her father George VI and his brother Edward VIII. I just couldn't get enough of the history. But also, let's be honest, of the scandals, the foibles, the treachery, and also, less frequently for some monarchs and more frequently for others, the virtues and the strengths of at least some of these people in power. And more than once during this time, my thoughts went to a particular passage in 1 Samuel. It describes a time when God's covenant people, tired of the tribal conflicts that kept them embroiled in wars with one another and with other nations, began to demand that the prophet Samuel anoint for them a king. Samuel was not pleased. But when he prayed to God about it, this is how God answered. "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who will reign over them." And he did. Here are the words of God that Samuel shared with the people at the time that they wanted a king. "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and some to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves." And even after this dire warning, a warning that the costs of having a king would far outweigh the benefits, the people continued to clamor. And so God gave them a king. The kings and queens whose stories flickered across my computer screen surely played according to type, as outlined by God in this passage. even those of relatively good character. Here's the problem. The kind of power traditionally given to royalty could corrode the morals of even those who started out promisingly. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. At her best, Queen Elizabeth I was smart and decisive. She gave a rousing speech to her troops and went among them in horseback, in her own personal battle armor, as they awaited the arrival of the Spanish Armada. She told them she was determined to live and die amongst them, to lay down for her God and for her kingdom and her people, her honor and her blood, even in the dust. And at her worst, Elizabeth was vain and petty. She favored those courtiers who flattered her most prettily. She condoned torture to find out whether her cousin was coming for her crown. At her worst, Elizabeth never even paid the sailors of the English fleet that met the Armada. After their victory, typhus swept through their ranks, and most of them died destitute, without the aid the royal treasury might have provided. Today's the last Sunday in the church year for many Christians around the world, and this day is known for them and for us as either Christ the King or Reign of Christ Sunday, highlighting that our Lord Jesus is King, not just for Christians, not just of the world, but over all the universe. And so the lectionary offers us readings to highlight and illuminate Jesus' kingship. In this morning's first reading, David, the second king of God's covenant people, is lying on his deathbed. Here he describes with his final breaths what he views as good kingship. The one who wrote so many beautiful psalms is still a spinner of lovely images. And here his thoughts fly on the wings of nature metaphors. The God of Israel has spoken. The Rock of Israel has said to me, one who rules over people justly, ruling in the fear of God, is like the light of the morning, like the sun rising on a cloudless morning, gleaming from the rain on the grassy land. And then, poignantly, hopefully, he adds, is not my house like this with God? That's me, right? Who wants to contradict an elderly king as he lies dying? And there is no question that David's reign is a highlight of the Hebrew Scriptures, and that he stands among the greatest kings of the old, biblically speaking. At his best, David is a uniter of fragmented and warring tribes, and an encourager of overmatched armies. Overwhelmed by his love for God, he dances before the Ark of the Covenant, and for God he composes and sings and plays songs of such beauty that we still have many of their lyrics thousands of years later. At his worst, David horribly abuses his power as king. He's a murderer. He ignores a heinous crime by one son against his sister and David's daughter, and watches as a legacy of bloodshed spreads throughout his family. Despite his legendary charisma and the blessing God bestows upon him, despite his being a man after God's own heart, David was still the kind of king God warned people against. And Jesus? What kind of king is he? I have to tell you the truth, when I read the Gospels, I don't know that Jesus is interested in the language of king and kingship. Any images we have of him as king are just that, images painted by those such as John of Patmos in the book of Revelation, or by the Christian faithful throughout the ages. But the way Jesus moves through the world and conducts his ministry are far from king-like in any traditionally understood sense of the word. Here's one example. I was watching Victoria and Abdul this weekend, so, on it goes. There is a scene in which Abdul touches the queen's knee because he's trying to teach her Urdu, and he's trying to help her pronounce something correctly. And he touches her knee because he's trying to get her to say knee. And we, the audience, are shocked. We know it's not right. He can't touch her knee. Even we 21st century Americans know you don't touch the queen's knee. Now, think of Jesus, standing waist deep in the muddy Jordan, waiting for John to put his arms around him and dunk him in those baptismal waters. Remember him surrounded by people who are sick, possessed with demons, and healing them, touching them. Recall him taking Peter's mother-in-law by the hand and healing her of her fever so that she can join in his ministry. Think of Jesus walking along dusty roads, making a paste of dirt and his spit and rubbing it into a blind man's eyes. Taking bread, breaking it and blessing it so that it can be shared with thousands of strangers or a dozen friends. Think of Jesus, who is so utterly unkinglike in his willingness to be near people, to touch people, to embrace people, to eat with them, to welcome them, no matter who they are or where they come from. Now think of Jesus as we see him today in this reading. You know what's happening without me telling you. Jesus has been arrested on specious claims. The idea that he might be angling to be king is making the rounds. And no one wants Jesus to be king less than the Roman Empire or its representative, the irritated governor, Pontius Pilate. Jesus is on trial for his life. His closest friends have abandoned him, denied even knowing him. And he's already been brutalized by the palace law enforcement. He stands with no witness or defense to his name before the highest local civil authority. Pilate asks Jesus, "Are you a king? Are you the king of the Judean people?" Jesus replies, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me? My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. You say that I am a king." Jesus doesn't exactly embrace the title. He speaks vaguely of another world, a claim that the Roman governor has no way of verifying. This is the nature of Jesus' kingship, if he is indeed a king. He can never be recognized by other kings because the moment they do recognize his authority, their own authority vanishes. It is a title that sits uneasily on this man, who has roamed the Judean countryside and Jerusalem's city streets, engaging in verbal skirmishes with religious and civil authorities alike. But more than that, shown so vividly that he belongs with and to the people in the flesh and blood. King is a title either too grand for him or too impossibly small. It's hard to tell. But then Jesus says something else. "For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." For Jesus and for us, the truth is this: our God is one who comes among us not as a king, not lording power and grandeur over us, but instead as living, breathing compassion. The truth comes as the light of the world, and as Jesus tells us that we too can be light. The truth comes as the one who brings healing to those who are hurting, and who shows us that we too can be wounded healers. The truth comes as Jesus' willingness to undergo pain so that we can know our pain has been seen and our struggle has been joined. The truth comes as one willing to lay down his life with us and for us. And this is exactly why Jesus is the one we are willing to call King. Before him, those who believe they have power must fall silent, are put to shame, and have no defense for their dishonesty and pretensions to glory, but to try as they can to extinguish him. Jesus is the one in whom we can put our trust, the one who tells us the truth, the one who is not grasping after the title of king, but who will accept it, the glory and the burden of it, if that is God's will for him and for humanity. Earlier this morning, we recited a prayer for new life together. We spoke of God's will to restore all things in God's beloved Jesus, our Lord and King. We prayed, "Grant, O Lord, that your people may be freed and brought together under the gentle and loving rule of Jesus." Jesus, the living one. Jesus, the gentle one. Jesus, the loving one. If we must have a king, by all means, let it be Jesus. Thanks be to God. Amen.